ancient trees witnessed her vow, their branches holding the echo long after the words left her lips. He will never reject his blood. It was a promise, a curse, and a declaration of war, all wrapped in the whisper of a single broken woman. Elara let the silence of the deep woods soak into her, a balm on the raw public wound. Behind her, the distant, discordant hum of the pack began shock giving way to murmurs, to speculation, to a feast of gossip. But here, there was only the crisp scent of pine, the hard frost under her bare feet, and the fragile, furious life inside her. She did not allow herself to crumple. Crumpling was for the girl who believed in love. The woman who remained stood straighter. With deliberate, almost ritualistic slowness, she reached up and began to unpin the diamonds from her hair. One by one, they fell into her palm, cold and sharp as his words. Next, she scraped at the silver ceremonial markings on her arms with a rough piece of bark, watching the sacred pigment smudge and flake away into the dirt. She was erasing the Nightfang pack from her skin. Each motion was a quiet severance. In the sacred grove, the silence had shattered into 100 pieces. The pack stood in a stunned, shifting mass. Eyes darted from the empty path where Elara had vanished into the shadows to the stone-still form of their alpha at the altar. The High Elder looked ancient and confused, his ritual script hanging limp in his hands, the torches guttered, making the scene jump and waver like a bad dream. Alpha Kale had not moved. He remained a statue carved from midnight and duty, his back to his people, his gaze fixed on the spot where Elara had last stood. The black pelt on his shoulders seemed heavier now, a mantle of pure ice. Beta Celine stepped forward, her face pale. "My Alpha, the ceremony." Her voice was a hushed blade in the quiet. Kyle did not acknowledge her. His jaw was a hard line, a muscle ticking relentlessly in his cheek. His hands, clenched at his sides, were white-knuckled. This was not the posture of a man who had made a clean, clinical choice for power. This was the stillness of a wolf holding itself back from a fatal lunge. Lyra, the Mountain Alpha's daughter, glided forward, a vision of calculated compassion. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch possessive. "Kyle," she said, her voice meant to carry, "your strength is the pack's strength. You bore a painful duty tonight for us all." At her touch, he flinched. A tiny, almost imperceptible recoil. But the pack saw it. A fresh wave of whispers rippled through them. He had rejected his chosen mate, publicly and brutally, yet he recoiled from the comfort of the politically perfect alternative. He finally turned. His storm-grey eyes swept over his pack, and the whispers died instantly, smothered by generations of ingrained obedience. But the tension did not leave. It thickened, becoming a fog of doubt. "The ceremony is concluded," Kyle announced, his voice hollow, stripped of the earlier decisive ice. It was just empty. "Return to your homes." It was a dismissal, but it felt like a retreat. He did not look at Lyra again. He did not explain. He simply turned and walked from the grove, not with the victorious stride of an alpha who had secured his future, but with the heavy, deliberate pace of a man walking to his own gallows. His silence was louder than any justification could ever be. The pack dispersed, but the air remained charged. The story was no longer just about the rejected mate. It was now about the alpha's silence, his hesitation, the profound wrongness that had settled over the grove like a curse. Elara, now miles into the border woods, felt the shift through the fading mate bond like a distant tremor. It was a thin, frayed thread now, stretched to its limit, but it still carried echoes. She stopped, one hand braced against the rough bark of an oak, the other splayed protectively over her womb. She closed her eyes, focusing past her own searing pain. She felt it not his thoughts, but the dark, turbulent storm of his emotion. There was no satisfaction there, no clean-cut duty, only a deep, resonant anguish, a chasm of regret that mirrored her own. A bitter, humorless sound escaped her. So he was not the untouchable, ice-hearted ruler he had played at the altar. He was in pain. Good. Let him drown in it. But the feeling confirmed her deepest, most agonizing suspicion. His rejection wasn't about her weakness. It was a chess move, and she and the child she carried had been sacrificed on the board. She opened her eyes, looking east, towards the mist-shrouded mountains that marked the boundary of Nightfang territory and the beginning of the unknown. The mate bond tremor faded to a dull, dead ache. He had severed it. She would learn to live with the phantom limb. Her composure, which had been a shield, now transformed into something else, a foundation. The hope was gone. The fear was being forged into resolve. The quiet, loving Elara was buried back in the grove, in the ashes of the ceremonial fires. The woman who emerged from the tree line as the first true rays of dawn touched the sky was someone new. Her gown was torn and stained with earth. Her feet were cut and frozen, but her eyes held a clarity that was sharper than any diamond. She looked back once at the territory that had been her prison and her promised land. Then she turned to face the wild, uncharted world. Her hand rested on her stomach, where a tiny, defiant heart beat in time with her own. He chose his silence, she said to the coming dawn, her voice steady as stone. Now he will live with it, and we, my little one, will learn to roar. The sacred oils smelled like ash. Elara stared at the intricate silver designs painted over her skin, the ceremonial markings of a future Luna, and felt her stomach twist. It wasn't nerves. It was a deep, visceral rebellion in her core, a secret she hadn't even dared to whisper to herself. Tonight, under the full moon, Alpha Kale was to bind his life to hers, and he would do it while unknowingly standing before the two of them, her and his heir, hidden beneath the silks and the silver. The chamber was thick with the scent of moon-blessed herbs and impending frost. Elara's handmaidens, Beta, Silene, and Thea, moved around her with a reverent silence, their fingers adjusting the fall of the gossamer-thin lunar gown. It was a garment of starlight and vulnerability, leaving her shoulders bare for the mating mark. "You're trembling, my lady," Selene murmured, her touch gentle as she secured a constellation of diamonds in Elara's dark hair. "It's just the cold," Elara lied, her voice barely a breath. The truth was a slow spreading warmth low in her belly, accompanied by a relentless, dizzying nausea she'd battled for weeks. She'd blamed the stress, the political machinations, the constant, watchful eyes of a pack that saw her as an orphaned ward, not a future queen. But this morning, as the dawn broke, the certainty had solidified within her. The missed moon cycles, the heightened scent, the way her body seemed to hum with a new, fragile life. She was carrying Kale's child. The knowledge was a luminous, terrifying secret. She had clutched it to her chest all day, a shield against the fear. Tonight, after the ceremony, she would tell him. She pictured his face, the harsh, beautiful lines of it, softening, the storm-grey eyes widening not with alpha calculation, but with awe. Their child, the heir to the Nightfang pack, it would be the final proof that his choice of her, a she-wolf of no notable bloodline, had been one of true love, not just fleeting passion. It would silence the council. It would make her safe. "The Alpha is ready," Thea said, her eyes downcast. There was something in her tone, a pitying note that made Elara's skin prickle. "Thank you, Thea," Elara said, forcing steel into her voice. She was not a victim tonight. She was a promise. The walk to the sacred grove was a blur of torchlight and shadowed faces. Pack members lined the path, their expressions unreadable. She heard the murmurs, felt the weight of their judgment. He could have chosen a stronger mate, a political alliance. What does she bring but a pretty face? Elara kept her chin high, her hand instinctively drifting to rest against the flat plane of her stomach. "I bring the future," she thought, and the secret glowed brighter, a tiny sun within her. The grove was a cathedral of ancient oaks and cold moonlight. The entire pack was assembled, a sea of expectant silence. And there, at the stone altar, stood Kale, her Alpha, her love. He was carved from moonlight and shadow himself, his broad shoulders draped in the ceremonial black pelt of his lineage. His jaw was set, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if already bearing the weight of kingdoms. When his eyes finally found hers, they did not soften as she dreamed. They were distant, glaciers under the moon. The High Elder's voice boomed, echoing the old rites. "We gather under the seeing moon to bind Alpha Kale, leader of the Nightfang pack, to Elara, his chosen mate. Does the Alpha accept this bond?" This was the moment. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird. She looked at Kael, pouring every ounce of her hope, her love, her secret into her gaze. "See me," she begged silently. "Choose us." Kael's voice, when it came, was not the warm rumble she knew in their private moments. It was the crack of winter ice, cold and final, ringing across the sacred space. "I do not." A collective, sharp intake of breath sucked the air from the grove. Elara blinked, certain she had misheard. The world tilted, the nausea surged, bitter at the back of her throat. "The bond is rejected," Kael declared, his eyes now boring into hers, but not with love, with a terrible, clinical resolve. "I cannot tie the fate of this pack to a liability, to a she-wolf with no alliance, no strength to offer in the wars to come. My duty is to the pack's survival, not to sentiment." Each word was a precise, surgical cut. Liability, no strength, sentiment. The pack's silence was no longer expectant. It was horrified, complicit. Elara saw Beta Silene look away. She saw the subtle, satisfied curve on the lips of Lyra, the daughter of the neighbouring mountain Alpha, a political prize Kael had often been urged to consider. The humiliation was a living thing, wrapping around her throat, hotter than any fever. It seeped into the sacred markings on her skin, tarnishing the silver. She felt the weight of every stare, the pity, the shock, the hidden glee, the secret in her womb, which moments ago had been a talisman of hope, now felt like a bomb, about to detonate her from the inside out. "Tell him!" A desperate voice screamed inside her. "Scream it! He rejected you, but he cannot reject his own blood." She opened her mouth, the truth a scalding wave ready to crash forth. But she looked into Kyle's eyes, the eyes of the strategist, the Alpha who had just publicly eviscerated her for the good of the pack. What would he do with the truth? Would he see it as a trap, a trick? Would he take her child, the heir, and cast her aside anyway? Would her baby become a political pawn, raised by a politically chosen Luna like Lyra? The words died. The hope died. A profound, icy calm descended over Elara. The dizziness, the nausea, the trembling, all of it froze solid. She straightened her spine, the gossamer gown feeling not like a shroud, but like the first layer of armor. She said nothing. She begged for nothing. She simply held the Alpha's glacial gaze for one endless, searing moment, letting him see the light in her eyes extinguish. Then, with a dignity that seemed to silence even the wind, she turned. She walked away from the altar, away from the gasps and the whispers, her bare feet silent on the frosted earth. She walked past the rows of pack members, who parted for her like ghosts. She did not look back. She walked until the torchlight faded, until the cold bit deep, and the darkness of the unclaimed woods embraced her. Only then, hidden by the ancient, indifferent trees, did her hand finally press firmly against her stomach. A single hot tear traced a path through the ceremonial silver on her cheek, but her voice was steel and stone when she finally whispered it to the waiting night, to the life within her, to the future she would now have to build from ashes. "He rejected me," she breathed, the words a vow etched in frost. "But he will never reject his blood." The air in the great hall was thick with the scent of pine boughs, roasted meat, and a buzzing, nervous energy. The feast to honor the new alliance was a pageant of forced celebration. Kael sat at the high table, a king on a throne of thorns. The formal proposal to Alpha Rogan had been sent. Lyra, resplendent in frost blue, occupied the seat beside him, the lunar seat, her presence, a silent proclamation that the pack was already moving on. But the pack hadn't. Their eyes kept darting from their stoic Alpha to the empty space where Elara should have been. Her absence was a louder presence than Lyra's carefully curated grace. It was Beta Garon who made the mistake, his voice booming with a forced joviality meant to bridge the uncomfortable silence. A toast to our Alpha's decisive leadership and to the strong future of the Nightfang pack. The toast was echoed, but the cheer was thin, brittle. It was then that the side doors opened. A hush fell, so complete that the crackle of the hearth fire sounded like thunder. Elara stood in the doorway. She was not in the torn, soiled lunar gown. She wore a simple, dark grey dress of wool, one meant for a junior she-wolf, not a chosen mate. Her hair was braided back severely, her face pale but composed, cleansed of the last traces of ceremonial silver. She carried a small, worn leather satchel. She had come not as a spectre of the ceremony, but as a petitioner, to collect her few belongings, to formally exit. Every eye locked onto her, the tension in the room coiled, electric and suffocating. Kael felt his heart seize, a violent, painful contraction in his chest. He hadn't expected to see her again. He had assumed she'd fled into the night, a clean if agonizing break. This was worse. This was a quiet, dignified confrontation. Lyra's smile tightened, her hand shifting subtly closer to Kyle's arm on the table. Elara did not look at the pack. She did not look at Lyra. Her gaze, steady and fathomless, found Kyle's across the crowded hall. In her eyes, he saw no accusation, no plea, only a terrible, quiet waiting. It was a mirror held up to his soul, and he could not bear his own reflection. He had a choice. In this moment, with the entire pack witnessing, he could show a shred of mercy, a nod of acknowledgement, a silent permission for her to pass. But the elder's words were a drumbeat in his skull. A Luna must be strong, vacuum, weakness, war. Lyra's expectant presence beside him was a brand. The fear, That old and ruthless master clenched its fist around his throat. If he showed any softness now, any hint of the torn man from his chambers, it would unravel everything. It would betray his reason for rejecting her. It would show the pack a divided alpha, and divided alphas are overthrown. He had to make it final. He had to kill the ghost publicly, once and for all. He rose from his seat. The scrape of his chair was the only sound in the world. "Elara," he said, and his voice was not the hollow rasp from his chambers, nor the warm rumble she had once known. It was the voice of the Alpha Stone, cold, controlled, and ringing with absolute authority. It carried to the farthest corner of the hall. "You do not have permission to be here." A collective intake of breath. She had not spoken, had not approached. She was merely existing. And he was declaring it a transgression. She didn't flinch. She simply waited, that same unnerving composure wrapping around her like a shield. Kael continued, each word a calculated strike, aimed as much at the watching pack as at her. "The matter of our previous understanding is concluded. The pack must look forward to strength, not to sentiment." He paused, his grey eyes like chips of glacial ice. He needed a reason the pack would accept, that would justify the brutality. The truth his cowardly, loving fear was impossible. So he reached for the cruelest half-truth he could fashion. "The role of Luna demands a fortitude you do not possess," he declared, his voice dropping, yet somehow growing even clearer. "It demands a resilience of body and spirit that is innate. You are too fragile. The coming storms would shatter you. And I cannot, and will not, tie the fate of this pack to fragility." Too fragile. The words hung in the air, monstrous and final. Gasps rippled through the crowd, sharp and pained. Some she-wolves looked away, ashamed. Others stared at Kael with dawning horror. He wasn't just rejecting her. He was annihilating her worth in front of the entire pack. He was declaring her essence, the very gentleness he had once claimed to love, to be a fatal flaw. Lyra's posture relaxed minutely, a queen assured of her throne. Elara did not cry. Her eyes didn't well up. She didn't tremble or break. She absorbed the words, the public evisceration, and for a long, suspended moment, she simply held Kael's icy gaze. Then she did something that would be seared into the pack's memory forever. She nodded. A single, slow, deliberate dip of her chin. It was not a nod of agreement. It was a nod of profound, devastating understanding. It was the acknowledgement of a verdict and the silent communication that the judge was the true criminal. In that simple gesture, she accepted nothing, but saw everything. The power in the room flipped. His cold, controlled speech suddenly felt like the frantic thrashing of a trapped animal. Her silent, composed nod was the calm of the executioner. Without a word, she turned. Her satchel in hand, she walked back toward the side door from which she'd entered. The pack parted for her once more, but this time their silence was different. It wasn't shock or pity. It was awe, tinged with fear. They had witnessed not a breaking, but a forging. Kael stood rigid, his hands clenched on the tabletop, the cold control on his face, a mask ready to shatter. He had gotten what he wanted. The rejection was absolute, public, and final. The ghost was laid to rest. But as the door closed softly behind her, sealing her out of his world forever, a chilling certainty settled in his bones. He hadn't shattered something fragile. He had unleashed something formidable, and he had just given it his air. The heavy oak door of the great hall closed behind Elara with a soft, definitive click. Inside, the silence remained, a suffocating blanket over the feast. Outside, in the stone-lined corridor, the world was cold, empty, and echoing. Her composure, that solid armor of silent understanding, held for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then the tremors began. They started deep in her core. A seismic vibration born of adrenaline, crash, and soul-deep violation. It raced along her nerves, making her muscles quiver. She locked her knees, forcing them not to buckle. Too fragile. His words were barbed hooks, still embedded in her skin, and every tremor tried to drive them deeper. She could still feel them. 100 pairs of eyes, though now separated by wood and stone, burning into her back. Their heat was a physical pressure between her shoulder blades. The ghost whispers of the pack seemed to slip under the door, coiling around her ankles like mist. Too fragile. Saw it coming. What did she expect? Alpha needs a fighter, not a flower. The walk down the long, torch-lit corridor to the servants' exit was a gauntlet of ghosts. She passed closed doors behind, which she knew the pack's children slept, the future she would never be part of. She passed the archway that led to the healing chambers, where she had once sat with the elderly, their gnarled hands patting hers, fragile. She passed the empty training yards, where the sounds of clashing steel had always made her flinch. Proof. Each step was an act of sheer, defiant will. Her body begged to fold, to sink against the cold stone wall and weep. The nausea, held at bay by shock and fury, rose again, a sickening tide. It was different now, laced with a bitter, metallic fear. Not fear of him, but for the tiny life inside her that had just been publicly declared unfit, unwanted, a product of fragility. She would not fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. She focused on the small, worn leather satchel in her hand. It contained a change of clothes, a moonstone pendant that had been her mother's, and a single dried flower Kael had given her on a long-ago spring day, pressed between the pages of a book. The entirety of her old life, distilled into a few pounds of weight. She reached the small, unadorned door at the corridor's end, the door used by cooks and cleaners, the exit for those who were not official, the final, fitting symbol. Her hand trembled violently as she reached for the iron latch. She clenched her fist, took a breath that shuddered in her lungs, and tried again. This time, her fingers closed around the cold metal. She pulled. The night air rushed in, sharp and clean, scented with frost and freedom. It was a slap, bracing and merciful. In the great hall, the spell was broken by the closing of the side door. A low, uneasy murmur rose to fill the void. Glances were exchanged over half-full goblets. No one resumed eating. Alpha Kyle remained standing at the high table. He had not moved since she left. His gaze was fixed on the door through which she had vanished, his face a masterpiece of carved stone. But beneath the table, hidden from the pack's view, his hands were fists, the knuckles white, the tendons standing in sharp relief. A single drop of blood welled where a fingernail had bitten too deep into his palm, spotting the fine linen tablecloth. He had watched her go. He had seen the straight line of her spine, the unyielding set of her shoulders, even as the faintest tremor had been visible in the torchlight. He had seen her pause, just for a heartbeat, before pushing the servant's door open, a silent acknowledgement of the ultimate demotion. Every instinct in his body, every pulse of the frayed and bleeding mate bond, had screamed at him to stop her. to roar at the pack, to stand down, to shatter the table between him and Lyra, to sprint after her and pull her back into the circle of his arms where she belonged. But his feet had been rooted to the dais. The weight of the pelt he no longer wore, the expectant stare of Lyra beside him, the watchful eyes of the elders, they were chains of pure obsidian. Duty, strength, survival. The words were a prison. He had chosen to let the silence stretch. He had chosen to let the walk of shame complete its course. His inaction was its own form of violence, more brutal than any command. Lyra's voice, smooth as oil, cut through his torment. The pack needs to see a united front, my alpha. She placed her hand over his still clenched fist on the tabletop, a possessive, performative gesture. The past is a path we do not look back upon. Her touch was fire and ice. It jolted him back. He slowly, stiffly, turned his head to look at her. He saw the calculated assurance in her eyes, the political victory neatly secured. He did not see a partner. He saw a treaty. With a force of will that drained the last warmth from his soul, he gave a single stiff nod. He unclenched his fist, ignoring the sting of the cut, and gently, so gently it screamed of revulsion, disengaged his hand from under hers. "Continue the feast," he said, his voice a hollow echo in the vast hall. Then, without another word, he turned and walked not toward the main entrance, but toward the private stair leading to his chambers. He left his pack, his new ally, and the ruins of his heart behind him. He did not look back. He couldn't. Outside, the heavy servant's door swung shut behind Elara, cutting off the last light and the last whisper from the world that had rejected her. She stood in the darkness, the trembling finally subsiding, replaced by a cold so profound it felt like clarity. She looked up at the sliver of moon, a pale claw in the sky. The walk of shame was over. Now the journey began. The solid thud of the servant's door shutting behind her wasn't just a sound. It was a guillotine blade falling. It severed the last, frayed connection to the warmth, the light, the life within the Night Fang stronghold. Outside, the world was a vast, indifferent expanse of frozen earth and star-stabbed sky. Elara took 5 steps into the shadows beyond the kitchen midden before her legs gave way. She did not crumple gracefully. She folded like a puppet, with its strings cut, collapsing to her hands and knees on the hard, frost-rimed ground. The cold shot through her palms, sharp and grounding. The composure that had held her upright through the ceremony, the silent walk, the public annihilation, shattered into 1,000 glittering, painful shards. A sound escaped her, a raw, guttural gasp that held no tears, just the sheer, overwhelming force of expulsion. It was the sound of her soul trying to vomit out the poison of the last hours. And then her body followed suit. She retched violently, her stomach heaving, but nothing came up but thin, bitter bile. It burned her throat, matching the acid of his words, still scorching her mind. Too fragile, a liability. She shuddered, her spine arching with the strain, the dark wool of her dress soaking up the damp from the earth. As the spasms subsided, leaving her trembling and hollow, a new wave of nausea rose, different from the panic. This was deeper, a fundamental wrongness in her center that had been her silent companion for weeks. She knelt there, forehead nearly touching the frozen dirt, and let the evidence she had so fiercely ignored assemble itself with brutal, crystalline clarity. The missed moon cycles. Not 1, but 2. She chalked it up to stress, to the pressure of the impending ceremony, The strange, vivid dreams not of running or hunting, but of deep, warm waters and a tiny, persistent light pulsing in the dark. The way her sense of smell had become almost painfully acute, making her recoil from meat and strong ale, while the scent of pine and fresh earth became intoxicating. The overwhelming fatigue that sleep could not touch, and the dizzy spells that came not from fear, but from standing too fast. And the nausea, always the nausea, a constant whispering companion she'd named nerves. A terrifying, wondrous, impossible possibility broke through the wreckage of her heart, cold and bright as the first winter star. No. She pressed a hand flat against her lower belly, where the emptiness of hunger and despair should have been. But it wasn't empty. There was a thickness, a subtle, firm curve she'd denied, hidden by loose gowns and her own desperate hope for a different future. A memory flashed, unbidden and searing. Kyle, weeks ago in the quiet of the forest after a run, his human form warm against hers, his lips at her throat, his whisper hot and fervent against her skin. You are my future, Elara. All of it. It had been a night of raw, unguarded passion, a night where duty and pack politics had felt a world away. It had been just before the last moon she'd bled. The math was cruel and incontrovertible. A choked sob finally broke free, but it was tangled with a wild, disbelieving laugh. The sound was eerie in the silent dark. She was carrying his child, Kale's heir, the next alpha of the Nightfang pack, conceived in a moment of what she had believed was love, now growing inside the woman he had just declared too fragile to be Luna. The terror was immediate and paralyzing. A pregnant, rejected she-wolf, alone in the wilderness? It was a death sentence. The pack would hunt her if they knew. Kyle, what would Kyle do? His cold, controlled face from the great hall superimposed itself over the memory of his loving one. Would he see this child as a trap, a political obstacle to be removed? Or would he take it and discard her completely? But beneath the terror, beneath the shock and the staggering betrayal, something else ignited. A tiny, fierce, and utterly primal spark. It was not her spark. It was theirs. Her trembling didn't stop, but its nature changed. It was no longer the shudder of collapse, but the vibration of a bowstring being drawn taut. She slowly pushed herself up from the ground, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. She looked down at her stomach, still flat to any unfamiliar eye, but now the center of her entire universe. The secret she carried was no longer just a fact. It was a weapon. It was a shield. It was a reason to survive that eclipsed all others. He had rejected her. He had shamed her. He had exiled her. But he had given her this. A grim, steely calm settled over her. The tears froze on her cheeks. She picked up her fallen satchel, her movements deliberate now, purposeful. She turned her back on the stronghold for the final time, not as a broken woman on a walk of shame, but as a guardian of a secret dynasty. Her path was no longer one of flight, but of exodus. Her hand rested on her stomach as she melted into the tree line, her whisper carried away by the wind that swept towards the unknown east. "You are not a liability," she said, voice low and firm, "a vow to the life within. You are the revolution." The eastern woods were not like the deep, familiar forests of the Nightfang territory. These trees grew in silence, their trunks twisted, their canopies holding secrets older than any pack. Elara moved like a ghost among them, guided by a memory, a whispered rumour of a place beyond pack laws, the Bramblewood. It was a place spoken of in hushed tones by pack mothers when scolding curious pups. Don't stray too far, or the Bramblewood wraith will get you. It was said to be a haven for those who did not fit. Broken warriors, banished wolves, and those who chose to live between the cracks of the great territories. And, it was rumoured, a healer lived there, one who asked no questions. Elara found the hut as the third dawn bled grey light through the mist. It was a low, moss-grown thing, half buried in a thicket of blackthorn and wild rose, the thorns as long as her fingers. It looked less like a dwelling and more like something the earth had grown to hide. The air smelled of damp earth, iron-rich water, and a bitter, herbal tang. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her body screaming with exhaustion, her mind a fragile crystal. She had survived on melted snow and stubbornness. The nausea was a constant tide now, ebbing and flowing but never truly gone. The secret in her belly felt heavier with every step, a truth demanding acknowledgement. The hide curtain over the doorway shifted, and a figure emerged. She was ancient, her back bent, her hair a wild cloud of silver-streaked black. Her eyes, however, were the colour of flint, and they saw everything. "Lost, little wolf?" the woman rasped, her voice like dry leaves. She didn't smell of any pack, only of the deep woods. "I am found," Elara answered, her own voice hoarse from disuse. "And I need to know what I carry." The healer's flinty eyes swept over her, from her worn boots to the dark circles under her eyes, lingering for a heartbeat on the hand Elara couldn't keep from hovering near her stomach. No pity softened that gaze, only assessment. "Come in, then. The brambles listen, but my fire does not." Inside, the hut was warm and dense, with the scent of drying herbs and peat smoke. The healer, who gave no name, motioned for Elara to sit on a low stool. Her hands, gnarled and strong, were surprisingly gentle as she examined her. She pressed cool fingers to Elara's wrists, listened to her breath, and finally laid a palm flat on her lower belly. A long silence filled the hut, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The healer closed her eyes. Elara held her breath. Finally, the old woman's eyes snapped open. She looked at Elara, and for the first time, her expression shifted. Not to kindness, but to a deep, weary understanding. "You carry life," she confirmed, her voice low, "new and strong, a moon perhaps a little more." She withdrew her hand, wiping it on her apron. "The blood in it runs with a storm, alpha blood, pure and potent." The confirmation was not a shock, but a seismic settling. The ground of Elara's reality shifted, and this new, terrifying continent was now her permanent home. Alpha blood, his blood. A son or daughter who would one day have the power to command the pack that had cast its mother out. The healer watched her, reading the storm in her eyes. "This truth is a weapon, child, and a target. What will you do with it?" The question hung in the smoky air. Visions flashed before Elara's eyes. Marching back to the Nightfang border, her belly swollen with evidence, throwing his rejection in his face before the entire pack. She imagined the chaos, the shame it would bring upon Kyle, the power it would momentarily grant her. It was a sharp, seductive fantasy of revenge. She looked down at her hands, still slender, still marked with faint lines of dirt from her journey. She thought of the tiny, fierce spark within her, the one that had ignited in the darkness. This child was innocent of its father's betrayal, of pack politics, of her own shattered dreams. It was pure potential. It was hers. He rejected me, Elara said, the words leaving her lips not as a sob, but as a solemn, foundational truth. The firelight danced in her eyes, which were dry and clear. He chose his pack, his duty, his fear over me. He looked at me and saw a liability. She placed both hands over her womb, a protective, claiming circle. Her voice softened, filling with a reverence that transformed her weary face. But this child didn't. The words landed in the quiet hut with the weight of a vow. This child, conceived in a moment she had believed was love, had chosen her. It was growing within her, tying its fate to hers with every beat of its tiny, burgeoning heart. It was the one thing from Kyle that was truly, irrevocably hers. Not a title, not a mark, but a life. I choose silence, Elara said, lifting her gaze to meet the healer's. There was a steel in her now, forged in the walk of shame and tempered in the confirmation of life. Not for his sake, for ours. My revenge will not be his shame. It will be our survival. It will be a life he will never know, raised far from his politics and his fear. The healer studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow, approving nod. She rose and moved to a cluttered shelf, returning with a small pouch of dried herbs and a tiny vial of dark oil. For the sickness, she said, pressing them into Elara's hands, and to mask the scent of the pup's bloodline as it grows. The woods have ears, and alphas have long memories. Elara accepted the gifts, her fingers closing around them. They were tools for her new path, the path of a mother, not a mate, a guardian of a secret dynasty. As she stepped back out into the misty dawn, the weight was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer the burden of a secret to be feared, but the sacred charge of a future to be protected. He had rejected her, but she would never reject this. It was her revolution, and it had just begun to beat. The Bramblewood healer's gifts were a lifeline. The bitter tea tamed the nausea to a manageable murmur. The dark oil, rubbed into her skin each dawn, masked the potent signature of alpha blood blooming within her, weaving a scent of wild mint and stone around the truth. It allowed her to move, to think, to plan. She did not stay in the Bramblewood. Sanctuary was not safety, and the old healer's eyes, while knowing, were still a pair of eyes. Elara's survival now depended on becoming a phantom. She found a shallow cave system a half-day's travel east, near a fast chattering stream. It was a damp, echoing space, but it was hidden. It would serve as her first true den. But before she could build a new life, she had to formally bury the old one, and for that she needed to go back. Not to the pack, never to the pack, but to the very edge of Nightfang territory, to a place only she and the memories knew. She waited for a moonless night when clouds smothered the stars and the world was reduced to shades of deepest grey. Cloaked in a hooded mantle of rough-spun wool, traded for a day's foraging, she moved like a shadow against the shadows. The oil did its work. She smelled of nothing but the forest. She was a wraith, invisible to the patrols whose distant howls she heard on the wind. She reached the sentinel oak just before true midnight. It was a massive, solitary tree that marked the northwestern boundary, its branches like arms raised in a perpetual warning. At its roots was a hollow hidden by a curtain of ivy. This had been their place, a secret spot where the Alpha's son and the orphaned ward could meet beyond protocol. Here she had hidden tiny tokens of their life. A smooth stone from their first secret swim, a fragile bird's skull they'd found together, the first wild flower he'd ever given her, now a brittle, brown ghost of itself. And the book, a volume of old human poetry, its pages soft with use. He'd read to her here, his voice softening on the verses about love and stars. Kneeling in the damp loam before the hollow, Elara emptied her worn satchel. Not to pack, but to unpack, to leave. She took out the moonstone pendant, her mother's last legacy. It gleamed faintly in the dark, a captive piece of the moon. She placed it gently in the hollow. She could not carry the weight of her mother's gentle hopes into the harsh future. Next came the pressed flower from the book, the one from the long-ago spring. It crumbled to dust between her fingers as she lifted it, a fitting end. She let the dust sift into the hollow. She did not take out the book. Instead, she opened it to the title page. There, in Kyle's strong, slashing script, was an inscription from a lifetime ago. For Elara, who teaches the moon how to shine. K. She looked at it for a long moment. Then, with a rock from the stream bed, she carefully scraped the ink away until only ragged fibers of the paper remained. The words were gone. Only the wound in the page testified they had ever been there. She closed the book and placed it atop the pendant. Finally, she unwound the simple silver bracelet from her wrist, a coming-of-age gift from the pack, a symbol of belonging. She laid it down, the cold metal a final, silent goodbye. Her satchel was now empty, a vessel ready to be filled with a new, raw existence. She stood, her body feeling both lighter and more anchored than ever before. She turned and looked south, towards the heart of the territory. In the absolute dark, she could not see the stronghold, but she could feel its presence, a low, distant thrum of power and warmth and rejection. She imagined the fires in the great hall, Lyra sitting in the Luna's chair, Kyle staring into some private darkness, a world spinning on, convinced it had neatly excised her. A cold, clean wind swept through the clearing, tugging at her hood. It carried no scent of home, only of the wilds ahead. Elara placed both hands on her stomach. The firmness was undeniable now, a subtle curve of life beneath her palms. The promise she whispered was not to the past, and not to Kale. It was to the future, to the child, to herself. I choose us, she breathed into the wind, her voice the steady, low hum of a bowstring. I choose the silence we will grow in. I choose the strength we will forge. They have their pack. We will have our world. It was not a vow of vengeance, but of creation. He had forced her to disappear from his story. Now she would write her own. With one last, lingering look at the dark shape of the sentinel oak, a tombstone for her old heart, she turned her back. She pulled her hood lower, shouldered the empty satchel, and walked into the deeper, waiting blackness of the uncharted east. She did not disappear in shame. She disappeared with purpose. A secret queen, abdicating one throne to build another, far beyond anyone's reach. In the Alpha's chambers, high in the stone heart of the Night Fang stronghold, a profound silence reigned. It was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that follows an explosion, leaving the air thin and ringing with absence. Kyle stood at the window, the same position he'd occupied for hours, watching the same patch of moonless, impenetrable dark where Elara had vanished. The feast below had finally ended, the forced laughter and uneasy music dying away. The pack had retreated to process the seismic shift. Lyra had been escorted to the most lavish guest suite, a silent statement of her new status. He was alone, and his wolf was tearing him apart from the inside. It had been restless since the moment he'd uttered the rejection in the grove. a snarling, pacing beast caged behind his ribs. Now it was worse. It wasn't just agitated, it was grieving. A raw, wounded howl echoed in the vault of his soul, a sound no one else could hear. It clawed at his control, demanding, screaming, protesting. It sensed what Kyle's human mind was trying desperately to rationalize. That something was missing. Not just a person, but a piece. The piece that had always balanced the ferocity of the alpha with something softer, something that made the weight of the pelt bearable. Her quiet laughter in the hallway, the scent of her hair as she passed, the way she could calm the storm in him with a single look, these were not sentimental luxuries. They were the keystone in the arch of his being, and without it, everything was beginning to strain and crack. The agitation was a physical itch under his skin, a pulling in his gut, tugging him towards the west wing, towards her old chambers. They would be empty now, stripped of her presence. But his wolf didn't believe it. His wolf insisted she was there, waiting, confused, hurt. It convinced his body. He moved without conscious thought. His feet carried him out of his room, down the silent, torch-lit corridor. The stone was cold beneath his bare feet. The stronghold slept, but it felt like a tomb. He passed a patrolling guard, who snapped to attention, eyes wide with surprise. Kyle ignored him, a phantom in his own home. He reached her door. It was slightly ajar. He could see darkness within. His hand rose, fingers hovering just above the worn wood. His breath caught. For a dizzying moment, the fantasy played out. He would push it open. She would be there, sitting on the edge of the bed, bathed in moonlight. She would look up, her eyes wounded but understanding. He would fall to his knees, bury his face in her lap, and beg. He would renounce it, all the title, the alliance, the duty. He would choose her. He would choose them. The pull was so violent it was a physical pain in his chest. His fingers trembled, inches from salvation and ruin. Then the vision shifted. He saw not her gentle face, but the cold, assessing eyes of Elder Thorn. He heard the distant, imagined war horns from the eastern clans. He saw the fragile, trusting faces of his pack's pups, their safety hinging on the mountain alliance. He saw Elara not safe in his arms, but lying broken on a battlefield because his love had made her a target. Too fragile. His own words, spoken to save her, boomeranged back and struck him in the heart. Was he saving her, or was he just too cowardly to protect what was his? His hand curled into a fist. The trembling stopped, replaced by a rigid, paralyzing tension. He could not go in. To step into that emptiness would be to admit the depth of his mistake, and a mistake admitted was a weakness exploited. An alpha could not afford such a luxury. The choice was made. The path was set. To waver now would unravel everything, make her sacrifice and his own torment meaningless. He let his fist fall slowly to his side. He took a single, staggering step back from the door. It did not arrive as a soft sorrow. It arrived as a shard of ice, piercing the numb space where his heart had been. It was the first, undeniable acknowledgement that his duty felt like damnation, that the strength he had displayed was a hollow performance, that in choosing the safety of his pack, he might have doomed his own soul. The agitated howl of his wolf subsided into a low, continuous whine of loss. The pull in his gut didn't disappear. It settled into a permanent, aching void. He turned away from her door, from the ghost of the future he'd murdered. The walk back to his own cold, empty chamber was longer than the journey to the edge of the territory. He did not sleep. He stood again at the window, watching the first bruise-coloured light of dawn bleed into the sky over the eastern woods, the direction she had gone. The restless night was over, but the restlessness was now a part of him. Regret wasn't an emotion, it was his new shadow, and it stretched long behind him, reaching all the way to a hollow at the base of a sentinel oak and into the determined heart of a woman who was learning to live without his light. The dawn that Cale had watched arrive with leaden eyes was now a cold, hard reality over Nightfang territory. It was the first dawn of the new era, the era of the Alliance, of Lyra, of strength without softness. Yet, the stronghold did not feel fortified. It felt haunted, an unease, thicker than the morning mist, had settled over the pack. The guards at the gate shifted on their feet, their eyes scanning the tree line not for enemies, but for a ghost. The she-wolves gathered at the well spoke in hushed tones, their glances flicking towards the empty servant's door. The Alpha's public rejection had been a quake, and the aftershocks were just beginning. Kyle stood in the training yard, trying to lose himself in the mindless, punishing rhythm of striking the practice post. His fists were raw, the skins split. But the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the hollow ache inside. With every blow, he saw her face in the grove, her silent nod in the great hall. A young scout, barely more than a pup, skidded to a halt at the edge of the yard, breathless. "Alpha!" Cale did not stop. "Thud, report." "The scent trail. Elara's." The scout stammered, fear and confusion in his voice. "It vanishes, completely. At the northeastern border stream. It's like she stepped into the water and never came out, or was plucked from the earth." Cale's fist froze in mid-air. He slowly turned, his grey eyes like chips of frost. "Vanishes?" "Yes, Alpha. We've fanned out for miles. There is no trace, no broken branch, no footprint beyond the stream. It's impossible. Unless..." The scout trailed off, too terrified to voice the thought. Unless she had help, or unless she was far more capable than anyone had ever believed. A cold that had nothing to do with the morning seeped into Cale's bones. Her final, composed nod replayed in his mind. That hadn't been the look of a broken woman fleeing blindly. It had been the look of a strategist executing a retreat. He had driven her out, but he had not driven her to her death. He had driven her away, beyond his reach. The realization was a new kind of terror. "Send riders to the bordering packs," he commanded, his voice rough. "Discreet inquiries. She may have sought shelter." He knew it was a lie, even as he said it. Elara would never go to a rival pack. She had too much pride, and it would be an act of war. The scout bowed and scurried away. The restless energy in Kyle's wolf became a frantic, scrabbling panic. Gone. No scent. No trail. It wasn't right. It meant she didn't want to be found. It meant she had a plan. And the ghost of the bond, now stretched to its absolute limit, hummed, not with despair, but with a terrifying, determined vitality. He couldn't breathe in the stronghold. The stone walls felt like they were closing in, carved with the ghost of her smile. He shifted in a blur of muscle and fury, his massive grey wolf bursting from his human skin. He needed to run. He needed to hunt. He took off, a streak of storm-coloured fur, bypassing his confused guards, heading not for the vanished trail, but on a punishing circular route around his territory's edge. He was Alpha. Nothing moved here without him knowing. Nothing. It was on the third, furious lap, his muzzle flecked with foam, that a foreign scent stopped him dead. It was old, earthy, herbal, and it carried a faint, lingering whisper of mint and stone, and something else, something buried so deep beneath the masking sense it was almost imaginary, a flash of storm-wild, alpha-potent blood gone before he could grasp it. It came from a dense, thorn-choked thicket east of the bramblewood, a place only outcasts and exiles knew. With a low warning growl, Cale shifted back. He approached the thicket on 2 feet, his power radiating, demanding submission. "Show yourself." The blackthorn branches shivered and parted. The bramblewood elder stood there, her flinty eyes meeting his alpha's glare without a flicker of fear. She had been waiting. "Alpha Cale," she rasped. "You hunt a ghost. Where is she?" The question was a snarl, barely human. The healer studied him, her gaze peeling back the layers of his authority, seeing the restless night, the raw knuckles, the hollow fury. She saw the man beneath the mantle, and in that moment her hesitation was not about fear of him, but about the weight of the truth she held. She knew. The realization hit Kyle like a physical blow. This old woman, living between worlds, knew where Elara was, or where she had gone. He took a step closer, his dominance pressing down on the small clearing. "Tell me." The healer's eyes held a strange mixture of pity and a deep, weary defiance. She was not of his pack. His power over her was limited. She chose her words with the care of one laying a live grenade on the ground between them. "She came to me, broken, but not shattered." The old woman's voice was low. She sought confirmation of what her body already knew, what your fear blinded you to. Kyle's blood turned to ice. Confirmation of what? The healer did not blink. She didn't just leave Alpha. A long, terrible pause stretched, filled with the sound of Kyle's world cracking down its foundation. The Helder finished, her words falling like stones into the silent void between them. "She left carrying your air." The forest air vanished from Kyle's lungs. The distant sounds of the pack, the wind, his own heartbeat, everything ceased. The words hung in the space between them, not as sound, but as a cataclysm. Your air. The nausea she'd brushed off as nerves. The unsteadiness he'd mistaken for fragility. The way her hand had drifted to her stomach in the grove. A gesture he'd seen as uncertainty, but was in fact protection. He had not just rejected his mate. He had rejected his child, his legacy, the future Alpha. He had cast out the next generation of the Nightfang line, calling it a liability. The cold, clinical choice for power now tasted like ash and monstrous, irreversible failure. His wolf, which had been howling in loss, let out a silent, internal scream of pure, undiluted agony. The Helder watched the truth detonate behind his eyes. She saw the Alpha mantle shatter, leaving only a shattered man standing in the thorns. Without another word, she melted back into the bramblewood, leaving him alone with the ruins of his kingdom and the devastating knowledge that his true enemy was no longer at the borders. It was the ghost of his own heir, growing in the womb of the woman he'd banished. The first true rays of dawn did not bring light to the Alpha's chambers. They brought judges. Kyle stood at the arched window, his back to the room, watching the silver-grey mist cling to the territory he had just betrayed his soul to protect. The black ceremonial pelt lay in a heap on the floor where he had torn it off, a shapeless shadow. He could still smell the sacred oils on his skin. and beneath them the fading, floral citrus scent of her, Elara. It lingered in the air of the room they were to have shared, a ghost already haunting him. The heavy oak doors swung open without a knock. The privilege of the council, he did not turn. He knew their faces without seeing them. Elder Thorn, a man of sinew and cold pragmatism, who had buried 3 alphas. Elder Evine, whose gentleness was a velvet glove over a will of iron. And Garin, his own father's beta, whose loyalty was to the pack's survival, not the alpha's happiness. You left the grove without giving the pack a clear path forward. Thorn's voice cut the silence, brittle as old bone. Your dramatic rejection necessitated an immediate stabilizing move. Your silence created a vacuum, and vacuums breed chaos. The Mountain Ridge Alliance is balanced on a knife's edge, Garon added, his tone the gruff sound of strategy. Rogan will see your public rejection of your chosen mate as a sign of decisive strength, but only if you immediately solidify the alternative. Hesitation is read as weakness. Doubt is a scent our enemies can track. Kyle finally turned. The dawn light carved the hollows under his eyes, the grim set of his mouth. He looked at the elders, but his gaze went past them, to the figure who glided silently into the room behind them. Lyra. She was no longer in ceremonial wear, but in a gown of deep frost-blue wool, the colour of her father's mountain peaks. Her blonde hair was a perfect cascade, her posture assured. She moved to stand beside the council, not with him, but as a living embodiment of their argument, the political solution made flesh. The pack needs a Luna who is a fortress, not a fragrance, Elder Yvain said, her voice softer but no less insistent. Her eyes held a flicker of pity, which was worse than Thorn's scorn. Elara was beloved by many for her kindness, but kindness does not fortify borders. It does not intimidate rivals. With the war drums echoing from the east, we need a symbol of unassailable strength. Lyra brings the military might of the mountain ridge. She brings the lineage of a warrior breed. A Luna must be strong, Kael. It is not a preference. It is a law of survival. A Luna must be strong. The words hammered into him, the same words he had chanted in his mind last night as he watched Elara walk towards him, luminous and fragile in her hope. He had seen the slight unsteadiness in her step, the pallor of her skin he'd mistaken for nerves. He had felt, through the faint pulse of their not yet sealed bond, a wave of dizzying vulnerability. In that moment, the fear had consumed him, not fear for his own heart, but a terror so vast it had frozen his blood. The vision had been instant and horrific. Elara, his gentle Elara, standing beside him as enemy wolves breached the walls, seeing her torn apart, seeing her used as a weapon against him. His love for her would be his and her ultimate liability. The rejection had been an act of brutal protection, carved from his own soul with a blunt knife. He had chosen to let her live in exile, hated but alive, rather than risk her destruction as his Luna. But now, facing the council and the walking symbol of his duty, the cost of that choice was a raw, screaming void in his chest. Lyra met his gaze, her blue eyes clear and calculating. "My father awaits your formal proposal," she stated. Not a request, but a reminder of the ticking clock. An alliance sealed by a mating bond within the moon's cycle. Together, we will be unbreakable. Kael's eyes flickered. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the duty-bound Alpha cracked. In that sliver of time, a storm of pure, agonizing love and regret flashed in the grey depths. A love he had just publicly denigrated as sentiment. It was a silent scream directed at no one, a confession he could never make. Then the fear snuffed it out. The fear for his pack, the fear of war, the haunting vision of Elara's blood on the stones, the fear that his love was, indeed, a fatal weakness. He looked from Lyra's confident face to the expectant, severe faces of the elders. The walls of his duty closed in, airtight and suffocating. His internal conflict was a civil war, leaving no victors, only scars. Love begged him to run after her, to find her in the woods, to fall at her feet and renounce his title. Fear whispered of slaughter and ruin, of a legacy of failure. Duty stood before him, cold and undeniable, in the form of a mountain princess and the survival of his people. His shoulders, which had borne the weight of leadership since his father's death, slumped almost imperceptibly. It was not a sign of surrender, but of a crushing acceptance. "Draft the alliance treaty," Kyle said. His voice scraped raw, devoid of any emotion at all. He was not looking at Lyra, but at the space just past her shoulder, where the ghost of a different future lingered. "The formal proposal will be sent to Alpha Rogan before sunset." It was done. He had chosen. Duty, carved from the stone of fear, had smothered desire. Elder Thorn nodded. A sharp, satisfied gesture. Lyra allowed a small, triumphant smile to touch her lips. They filed out, their purpose achieved, leaving him alone in the chamber that smelled of a ghost. Only when the door thudded shut, sealing him in his chosen tomb, did he let his head fall into his hands. The image burning behind his eyes was not of a strong Luna on a throne, but of Elara's hand, pressed to her stomach as she walked away, and the devastating, final silence he had forced upon them both.